Well, the Middle East has been a challenge for Mr. Blair, both during and after his time as Prime Minister. But he was to score resounding success when he reached, in 1998, a deal for peace on the Good Friday Agreement, ending almost 30 years of deadly conflict, killing more than 3,000 people in Northern Ireland. We asked him if there was a case to be made for exporting that model of peacemaking to the Middle East.
I mean, there are certain things in common, certain things that are very different. But essentially, we were able to come to a framework agreement in April 1998, as you say, but then it took us another 10 years, really, to put the different elements of the peace process in place. And even today, you're still working on it all the time to keep the peace strong and successful. And I think the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a lot more complicated, but in essence, it's still the same in the sense that you need a framework agreement where the Israelis genuinely feel that they're secure, that they're not going to get threatened, as they've just been from the attack in Gaza, and the Palestinians feel that they are going to be able to govern themselves without, as there is on the West Bank, and of course as there is now in Gaza, the constant Israeli presence, and the absence of Palestinian freedom to be able to live their lives in the way that they want.
This was in your earlier book, A Journey, in which you said truth was stretched to the point of breaking in order to reach a settlement on peace in Northern Ireland. I believe the phrase constructive ambiguity gained parlance largely because of the success of peace in Northern Ireland. Does it strike you as, I suppose, historically unfair that what was acceptable and lauded as success for Northern Ireland in the case of Iraq became something for which you were criticized, stretching truth to the point of breaking?
Yeah, I mean, look, things are never perfect when you're engaged in politics, and when you're trying to negotiate a peace agreement and the consequences of that, there are times you do have some ambiguity in position, and you have to be prepared to adjust and do a bit of swerving and dipping and diving from time to time. But I think, provided your objective has integrity, provided you're trying to do something that's right, you can forgive a bit of political maneuvering.
Was there any employment of constructive ambiguity in terms of convincing the House of Commons and the British people that it was right for the UK to intervene in Iraq? In Iraq.
No, that was a clear decision post 9/11. My view was that Britain had to be with America, and that we had to deal with the threats in the Middle East, and Saddam Hussein was one of those threats. So that was a view I had then, and I was completely open with people as to why I thought it. And of course, you can get criticised for these decisions, but in the end, what government's about is being in position and taking decisions.
I'll bring you back to, as a comment you made in your book, ambivalence on the extreme right and the extreme left in countries when it comes to Vladimir Putin. Because whatever the reservations might be about him as a leader, he has, as a strong man, delivered on some things, or made decisions that a weaker man might not have been prepared to make. And getting closer to, and again I quote you, to extraordinary club of Russia and China, you have two countries that are in their ways delivering. And that is of concern to you.
Yeah, but I think we've got to be very careful of this. So what I think you can learn from Putin is staying power. You mentioned Iraq a moment ago, and you've got Afghanistan. I mean, in Syria, Putin intervened. We intervened, and we gave the people a chance of democracy. He intervened to prop up a dictator. But 12 years, 13 years later, he's still there. He has that staying power. And I think the West and Western leaders often lack that staying power. But that's not a lesson I would apply outside of, staying power is one thing, but how he's used that power, I think particularly in respect of Ukraine, has been devastating for Ukraine and also for Russia. Likewise with China, yes, there's a strong leadership there, But I still think it would benefit from being open to challenge and to a way of governing that would allow different views to be held.
We're looking ahead into elections in the United States. Whoever gets elected, do you see the US staying sufficiently engaged, and for the rest, so the UK, Europe, staying on side to ensure that your idea of a values-based, rules-based international system stays in place and we stave off conflict on the wider stage?
I think so. Look, in all countries, in America and many of the European countries, European politics is in a pretty febrile state. And in the UK, obviously, we've been through some very difficult times and Brexit and all of that. So I think in all of the countries, there's quite strong forces of isolationism and, wanting to just look after ourselves and not get too engaged in the world. But in the end, you're driven to get engaged because it's necessary to protect not just your values, but your interests. And I think with America, we need America active in the world, and it will stay active. Now, occasionally it looks like it won't, but in the end it will, because ultimately it's in America's interest to stay engaged with the world. And, particularly now that you have this quite, strong division between China and the West, America needs allies. And America's not going to get allies unless it engages with them and stays involved with them. That's why whatever people say, I think the transatlantic alliance between America and Europe, and I include Britain in this, will stay strong. I think NATO will stay strong. And I think we will continue to build alliances within the world. And we'll do that not out of some misplaced idealism, but we'll do that because realistically, that's the best way to make sure that we protect our values, our interests, our way of life.
So foreign policy, the division between realpolitik and values-driven foreign policy, there is no real division.
I think ultimately there isn't, because in the end, of course, you want to defend. If your values are integral to your country and you want to defend your country, then you've got to make sure that your country's interests are also protected. People often talk about realpolitik as if that means that you're completely cynical about the world. You just do whatever's right for the moment, but you don't really care about the values that underpin policy. I don't think that's the way most leaders look at it. So most leaders, I think, realize you've got to be, for example, countries may do things you disagree with, but it doesn't mean to say you break off relations with them. But that's not ignoring your values. It's protecting your interests so that those values can be sustained. And therefore, I've always thought this concept between values on the one side and interests on the other is really a bit of a false distinction. In the real world, protecting your interests advances the protection of your values most of the time.